We have a lot of the same bone structure and a
Yeah.
lot of skin
Well,
color
Michael
the
does
same.
now because he's had it all done.
I refuse you to insult Michael. He's a friend of mine.
Yeah.
I love him,
Yeah.
and I don't like people making.
At 81 years old, Diana Ross steps forward to break a silence she has carried for more than half a century. Her voice trembles, not from age, but from the weight of secrets buried too long. For decades, the world saw her as the Queen of Motown, a flawless diva, and a guiding star to Michael Jackson, the boy wonder who grew into the king of pop. Fans believed their bond was nothing more than sisterly affection, a pure friendship between two icons of music. But Diana Ross now declares the truth is far darker, far deeper, and far more dangerous than anyone ever imagined. She speaks of whispers in the dark, trembling hands, glances that lingered longer than they should, of secret nights where love and fear intertwined, and of 5 tragedies that could send shivers down the spine of even the most loyal fans. Why, she asks, did Michael leave her in his will as the only person outside his family trusted to raise his children? Why, years after his death, does she still hear his voice in her dreams? Tonight, Diana Ross strips away the glitter of fame to reveal the hidden story of a love, an obsession, and a tragedy that the world has never heard until now. The spring of 1969 was supposed to mark a new beginning for me. I had just stepped away from the Supremes, the group that had defined my life and my identity, to pursue a solo career. The world called me the Queen of Motown, but behind the titles and glamour, I was frightened. Berry Gordy had placed the weight of the entire label on my shoulders. Every camera followed me, every whisper in the industry carried my name, and every misstep threatened to shatter the illusion of perfection that had been carefully built around me. I was 25 years old, celebrated as untouchable, but inside, I was trembling. Then, one afternoon inside Hitsville, Detroit, fate introduced me to a boy who would alter the course of my life forever, Michael Jackson. He was just 11 years old, tiny, almost fragile, clutching a coat too big for his body as if it could shield him from the world. His brothers stood proudly beside him, but his eyes, those eyes, didn't look at anyone else in the room. They locked on me, wide, sparkling, as if they held the entire universe. Barry smiled with the pride of a man who had discovered buried treasure. Diana, this is the Jackson 5, and this is Michael. This boy is going to make the whole world bow down. I bent toward him, flashing the smile the world adored, and whispered a simple hello. His voice was soft, trembling, as he mumbled a shy greeting back. In that moment, I thought he was just a child. But then, the music started. The band struck the first notes of I Want You Back, and Michael's tiny frame transformed into something larger than life. His voice pierced through the studio walls, soaring, commanding, with a maturity and power that no 11-year-old should have possessed. The room went silent, not from respect, but from disbelief. This was no ordinary child. This was destiny unfolding before my very eyes. I watched him sing, and I felt something shift inside me. I had seen talent before, but this was different. It wasn't just skill. It was a fire, a presence, a brilliance that made you wonder if he had been sent from another world. I didn't just hear a boy sing. I saw the birth of a legend. I brought the Jackson 5 onto the television stage for the first time at the Hollywood Palace. I stood next to Michael as cameras rolled and millions watched. His small hand gripped mine tightly, trembling, his knuckles white with fear. But when the lights hit, he looked up at me, smiled, and transformed. The crowd roared, and I knew the world was falling in love with him, just as I had in that Detroit studio. Yet even then, something unsettled me. It wasn't just admiration in his eyes when he looked at me. There was a pull, something quiet and unspoken, a bond forming before either of us could name it. The world saw an innocent boy stepping into stardom. I saw a soul tying itself to mine. That night, as the applause thundered through the theater, I asked myself a question that would haunt me for decades. Was I simply witnessing the rise of a star, or was this boy's fate entwined with mine in ways I could not yet understand? In the early 1970s, as Motown tightened its grip on the music industry, Michael Jackson began to grow closer to me than anyone else in the label. To the world, He was just a child prodigy, leading the Jackson 5-1 hit after another. To me, he was Little Michael, the boy who clung to my hand on stage, who called me Sister Diana, with a sweetness that melted even the hardest days. At first, I thought it was only admiration, the kind of innocent attachment a boy might feel toward a woman he trusted. He followed me around the studio like a shadow, his eyes never leaving me. He would wait outside my dressing room, sometimes too shy to knock, holding a teddy bear as though it was the last piece of childhood he could still cling to. But as time passed, I began to notice something deeper, something that unsettled me in ways I couldn't admit to anyone. It wasn't just the bond of mentor and student, not only the sisterly affection I offered to calm his nerves before a performance. There was a look in his eyes that carried more weight than a child's gaze ever should. It was quiet infatuation, unspoken but powerful. I remember one night in 1970, after a performance in New York, when he knocked on my hotel door. I opened it to see him standing there in his pajamas, clutching that teddy bear like a lifeline. His voice trembled as he whispered, "Sister Diana, I'm scared. The lights, the screaming. I'm afraid it's going to swallow me." I pulled him into my arms, stroked his hair, and told him not to be afraid, that I would always be there for him. He looked up at me, tears streaming down his cheeks, and whispered words that, at the time, I thought were just childish. "I trust you. I love you," I believed. Then it was only the pure love of a boy desperate for stability. But years later, I would understand it differently. It wasn't just comfort he sought. It was a prophecy, a declaration of devotion that would follow us for life. In 1971, as Michael sang "Never Can Say Goodbye," I sat backstage, hidden from the crowd, watching him pour his entire heart into the song. For the first time, when his eyes searched for mine, it wasn't the gaze of a boy. It was the gaze of a young man placing his soul into my hands. My heart raced, my palms damp, as though some invisible line had been crossed. I smiled for him, proud and supportive, but deep inside, I trembled. I was beginning to realize that this wasn't only admiration, it was the birth of something more dangerous. People at the label noticed how much time he spent with me. They laughed, calling him my shadow, my little brother. But behind those jokes was something I dared not say aloud. I could feel the fire flickering, a fire that would one day grow into an uncontrollable blaze. The press adored us. Fans believed the Sister Diana bond was heartwarming, a story of a Motown star taking a child under her wing. And for a time, I convinced myself that was all it was. But every glance, every moment when his hand lingered in mine, every time his voice softened when he said my name, I felt it. Something forbidden was blooming between us, and neither of us knew how to stop it. By 1980, everything had changed. I was 36. No longer the fresh young singer Berry Gordy had molded, but a seasoned star carrying the weight of Motown's legacy on my shoulders. Michael was 21, stepping into manhood, preparing to do something no singer before him had ever done: conquer the entire world with Off the Wall, and soon after, Thriller. When I first saw him again at a Motown party that year, I almost didn't recognize him. Gone was the shy little boy who clutched a teddy bear in hotel hallways. In his place stood a young man, slim, stylish, with a soft afro framing a face that carried both innocence and intensity. But what startled me most wasn't his appearance. It was his eyes. They were the same eyes that had followed me around studios a decade earlier, but now they burned with something new: desire. That night, when the party ended and the crowd scattered, Only the two of us remained in the large, empty room. Michael walked toward me slowly, a nervous smile on his lips, and whispered words that froze me in place. "Sister Diana, I've been waiting for this day. I want you to see that I'm no longer that little boy." My heart pounded so hard I had to turn away. The line between sisterly affection and forbidden love blurred in an instant. I tried to laugh it off, but deep inside, I knew the fire had already been lit. By 1982, Thriller was born, and Michael became the biggest star on the planet. The press clung to every word he spoke, and in interview after interview, he mentioned my name. He called me his first love. The headlines exploded. "Michael Jackson in love with Diana Ross." I laughed when I read them, pretending to dismiss it, but every time I saw him, I knew those words weren't a joke. They were his truth. One evening after the American Music Awards in Beverly Hills, Michael appeared at my apartment unannounced. He brought with him a bouquet of white roses, placed them gently on the table, and looked at me with those same burning eyes. "They call me the hero of the world," he whispered, "but I don't care about that. I just want to be your man." I broke down in tears because, in that moment, I realized his feelings had grown far beyond admiration. This was no longer the innocent affection of a boy. It was love. A love both beautiful and dangerous, because the entire world was watching us. From that night forward, rumors spread like wildfire. Cameras caught him holding my hand longer than necessary at events. Lingering glances we couldn't hide, smiles that revealed more than we wanted to admit. Whispers began to echo in the halls of Motown. There's something between them, something more than friends. Once during a rehearsal in Los Angeles, the lights went off, leaving us in the dark. Michael leaned close, his voice trembling, and whispered, "If the world won't accept us, would you dare to love me in the dark?" I didn't answer with words. I simply placed my hand on his cheek, a gesture more powerful than anything I could have said. That single touch spoke the truth neither of us could voice. In public, I was Diana Ross, an icon, untouchable. He was Michael Jackson, the king of pop in the making. Together we were perfection in the eyes of the crowd, but behind the curtain we were two souls drowning in feelings we weren't supposed to have. We weren't allowed to fall in love, yet our hearts paid no attention to reason. In 1984, during the Jacksons' Victory Tour, I visited backstage. Cameras caught us laughing, our hands touching, our faces glowing in a way we couldn't disguise. The very next morning, headlines screamed across newspapers. "Diana Ross, Michael Jackson's mystery woman." Neither of us spoke a word in response. That silence only made the rumors louder, heavier, more seductive. One night in a Motown studio, long after everyone else had left, I sat beside him as he played a slow melody on the piano. His voice was soft, trembling as he sang, "Lady in my life, stay with me." Tears rolled down my cheeks because I knew without question that the song was for me. No one else would ever understand it, but I did, and so did he. The 1980s were Michael's golden years, the decade that transformed him into a global phenomenon. But for me, it was the decade when I felt like I was living inside a love that was both real and unreal, intoxicating and tormenting. When people asked me if there was ever something between Michael and me, I always smiled and stayed silent, because the truth was too dangerous to confess. Yet in every touch, every glance, every song he wrote, the answer was already there. We had stepped onto a path with no way back, a path of secrets, shadows, and a love we could never claim in the light. The second half of the 1980s was when our bond crossed the invisible threshold, and settled into something neither of us could deny anymore. To the world, Michael was the king of pop, untouchable, unstoppable, and adored by millions. To me, he was still the boy who once knocked on my hotel door in pajamas, trembling with fear, clutching a teddy bear. But now he was a man, and the love in his eyes had grown too powerful to ignore. What had begun as admiration had evolved into a secret love affair, hidden from cameras, hidden from family, hidden even from the people we trusted most. Our meetings were never public. We found each other in dimly lit studios after everyone had left, in luxury hotels with curtains drawn tight, in the corners of rooms where shadows could shield us from the flashing cameras. Michael would often slip away in the middle of the night and call me in whispers. "Diana," he'd say, his voice breaking across the phone line, "I feel so lonely. The whole world claps for me, but all I want is a hug from you." I would close my eyes, pressing the phone to my ear, my heart breaking, and whisper back, "You're not alone, Michael. You have me. You always will." And he would laugh softly, a boyish laugh that carried the weight of sorrow, before ending the call. But after every one of those calls, I cried myself to sleep, because I knew this love, as real as it was, could never survive in the daylight. The press began circling like vultures, catching fragments of our truth. Photos of us leaving the same hotels, stolen glances during award shows, whispers caught by microphones not meant to be on. Tabloids screamed with speculation. What is going on between Diana Ross and Michael Jackson? But we remained silent, and in that silence, the rumors grew louder. Silence, we discovered, is the most seductive answer of all. Once, during a rehearsal in Los Angeles, when the lights unexpectedly cut out, I felt his hand brush against mine. His breath was trembling as he whispered, "If this world never accepts us, will you still love me in the dark?" I didn't dare reply with words. Instead, I placed my hand against his cheek, stroking it gently. That one touch spoke volumes. In that darkness, we weren't a diva and the king of pop. We were just two souls, stripped of fame and fear, clinging to each other in the only way we knew how. Those years were filled with hurried embraces, trembling kisses, and whispered promises made in hotel rooms where the world couldn't see. And yet, every time we stepped back into the light, we had to pretend we were strangers. He would stand on stage, his hand brushing mine longer than necessary, his eyes locking onto me for a moment too long. I would smile politely, as if nothing was happening, even though my heart was burning with the weight of secrets. Michael once told me in the quiet of a dressing room, "Diana, if the world only knew how much I love you, they would never believe it." And I looked at him, my own eyes filling with tears, and whispered, "They don't have to believe it. Only we need to, but secrecy is both a shield and a curse." Every stolen moment of love was matched by hours of denial, by the pain of seeing him linked to other women in the press, by the heartbreak of having to walk past him in public, as if he were only a colleague, only a friend. Sometimes I thought it would destroy us. Yet every time he called me, every time his trembling voice whispered my name, I knew the truth. We had already gone too far to ever go back. Love in the dark was all we had, and for years, that was enough to keep us alive. By the time the 1990s arrived, Michael Jackson was no longer just the king of pop. He was a living god to millions. His moonwalk had become a universal language, his albums shattered every record, and his concerts drew crowds larger than nations. But behind the flawless performances and dazzling lights, his life was unraveling. And in the shadows of that unraveling, I was still there. I was 46. Michael was 32. The world saw us as two untouchable icons. Me, the eternal diva, and him, the eternal star. But when the cameras switched off, we were simply two souls clinging to each other in secret. I will never forget the night of the Motown 25th Anniversary Gala in 1983, when Michael unveiled the moonwalk for the first time. The world gasped, but my tears blurred the stage lights. He bowed to the audience, but his eyes were searching only for me. That night, when the crowd dispersed, he grabbed my hand backstage, trembling with excitement. "Did you see, Diana?" I did it. And then, lowering his voice to a whisper, "When I moonwalked, I wasn't thinking of them. I was thinking of you." That memory lingered with me throughout the years, even as the storms grew darker. By 1993, Michael faced the first and most devastating allegations of his career. Headlines blared his name with words too cruel to repeat. Overnight, he was no longer the untouchable star, but a hunted man. The world judged him before the courts even spoke. And the boy I had met at 11 years old now looked like a man being devoured alive. I flew to Los Angeles quietly, slipping into the studio where he was hiding from the cameras. I found him alone, shoulders slumped, eyes hollow. A man who had forgotten how to smile. "Diana," he whispered, as I wrapped my arms around him. "They're going to destroy me. They won't let me live." His voice cracked, and in that moment, the world's biggest star was nothing more than a frightened child again. I stroked his hair, choking on my own words. "Michael, you are still my man. No matter what they say, you are still mine." We cried together that night, his tears soaking my shoulder, my tears falling onto his. That was the night I knew our love was both salvation and torment. Because the more the world turned its back on him, the more he needed me. And the more I gave myself to him, the deeper our secret became. The following years were filled with moments no one else would ever see. Hotel rooms where he collapsed into my lap, exhausted, whispering he couldn't go on. Dressing rooms where I kissed away his tears before he stepped on stage. Phone calls at 2 a.m. where he admitted he wanted to disappear forever. The world thought he had endless strength. I knew the truth. Michael was breaking piece by piece. And yet, no matter how many times I told myself to walk away, to protect my own image, to let him fight his battles alone, I couldn't. Every time he called, I answered. Every time he whispered my name, I ran to him. The 1990s became years of storms, years when the spotlight turned from worship to condemnation. And through every thunderclap, every lightning strike, I was there in the shadows, holding the man the world no longer understood. To the public, I was Diana Ross, forever silent, forever dignified. But behind closed doors, I was simply a woman in love with a man drowning in fame and scandal. A love that could never be spoken, but a love that bound me to him until the end. As the 1990s bled into the 2000s, the world still saw Michael Jackson as immortal. They saw the sparkling jackets, the gravity-defying spins, the voice that could silence stadiums. But what they didn't see was the fragile body hidden beneath the sequins, the man who winced every time sunlight touched his skin, or the star who called me at 3 a.m., his voice shaking, confessing that he was afraid to close his eyes. By then, I knew his body was betraying him. Michael suffered from vitiligo, a disease that stripped the pigment from his once warm brown skin, leaving behind pale blotches that makeup could never fully cover. The world mocked him, tabloids spreading cruel lies that he bleached himself to deny his race. But I knew the truth. I had seen him backstage, staring into mirrors with tears in his eyes, whispering, "Diana, do you see it?" My skin is disappearing piece by piece. I would hug him from behind, holding him tightly, whispering that he was still the man I loved, no matter what happened to his body. But vitiligo wasn't the only battle. He also carried lupus, an autoimmune disease that left him in constant pain, draining his energy, making him hypersensitive to light. Every time he stepped outside, it was as though the sun itself was attacking him. He wore hats, gloves, and layers not for style, but for survival. The same costumes fans adored were his armor against a world that could hurt him with something as simple as daylight. And then came the sleepless nights. Insomnia haunted him like a ghost. He would toss and turn, mind racing with music, memories, and paranoia. Often my phone would ring in the middle of the night. On the other end, his voice would crack, trembling. "Diana, I can't sleep. I'm afraid that if I close my eyes, I won't wake up again." I would stay on the line for hours, listening, soothing him, promising he wasn't alone. But as much as I loved him, I couldn't fight the demons inside his mind. To survive, Michael began leaning on medication. Painkillers for the injuries his body carried after decades of brutal rehearsals and performances. Sedatives to chase sleep he could never find. Pills to calm his fears. Injections to silence his mind. Prescriptions stacked upon prescriptions until they became more lifeline than treatment. I saw the changes, the shrinking frame, the trembling hands, the way his eyes dulled when once they had lit entire rooms. Every pill he swallowed was like a step closer to a cliff, and I knew he was walking toward the edge even as I tried to pull him back. I begged him once, tears in my eyes, "Michael, please, you don't need all this. You have me. Let me be the one to hold you when it gets too hard." He smiled weakly, kissed my hand, and whispered, "You're the only thing keeping me alive, Diana. But I can't live without the music. And I can't make the music without this." It was a confession and a curse. Because even as I promised to stay by his side, I knew I couldn't save him from the storm inside his veins. Fame had given him the world, but it had also given him pain, and the only escape he could find came in bottles and syringes. And so, while the world screamed his name, I held on to the truth in silence. Michael Jackson, the greatest star alive, was also the most fragile soul I had ever known. And every night he fell asleep with chemicals coursing through his body. I wondered if tomorrow would be the day the world lost him forever. If the 1980s had been Michael's golden era, then the 2000s were his crucifixion. The very people who once crowned him King of Pop now sharpened their knives. Headlines that once celebrated his brilliance began to spit venom. His image shifted from genius to suspect, from hero to target. And in 2005, the storm reached its peak. Michael Jackson was dragged into court in Santa Maria, California, accused of the vilest crime a man could ever face. I sat in my home, frozen in disbelief, as news anchors repeated his name in the same breath as words too cruel for me to speak aloud. For the world, it was entertainment, a circus. For me, it was agony. Every time I saw his face on the screen, gaunt, pale, his eyes empty, I knew the truth. He was already being destroyed, regardless of the verdict. I flew quietly to Los Angeles, finding a way to see him away from the cameras. When I walked into the hotel room, the sight broke me. The man once adored by billions was hunched over in a chair, head in his hands, shaking. He looked up at me with red, swollen eyes and whispered, "Diana, they want to bury me alive. They're not going to let me get back up." I sat beside him, took his hand, and whispered, Even if the whole world turns its back, Michael, I will still believe in you." He gripped my hand so tightly it hurt. Then he asked the question that shattered me. "If they find me guilty, will you still love me?" My tears fell before I could answer, but I held him close, whispering through sobs, "Real love never disappears. Not then, not ever." When the trial ended and the words "not guilty" were spoken, the crowd outside cheered and the media roared. But I saw it in his eyes. Michael hadn't won. He walked out of that courthouse with a faint smile, waving weakly to the cameras, but the fire inside him had been extinguished. Innocent, yes. Whole. Number. The damage had already been done. The crown remained, but the spirit beneath it was broken. In the years that followed, his decline accelerated. His health crumbled. He grew thin, his voice raspy, his movements slower. By 2006, when I visited him in a secluded estate, I barely recognized him. He confessed to me, "Diana, this body doesn't belong to me anymore. I'm only alive because of the music." He looked like a man who was already halfway gone. I begged him to rest, to find peace, but he shook his head. "Music is my breath. If I stop singing, I'll die." And so he pushed forward, even as his body screamed for mercy. Lawsuits piled against him, debts mounted, vultures circled for pieces of his empire. Paparazzi hounded him at every turn. One morning, the tabloids plastered a photo of me leaving his house. The headline screamed, "Diana Ross, Michael Jackson's secret woman." I read it, heart aching, because though the words were cruel, they weren't entirely wrong. I was his secret, and he was mine. But secrets cannot shield you from the world forever. By 2007, Michael was a shadow of himself. The man who once moonwalked across the stage with limitless energy was now struggling just to stand tall. Yet even then, his eyes still carried that same plea I had seen since he was 11 years old. "Don't leave me." And I never did. I remained, silently, steadfastly, even as the world ripped him apart. He was no longer just Michael Jackson, the superstar. To me, he was the wounded soul I had promised to protect. But the truth haunted me every night. I could protect him from the cameras, from the tabloids, from the world, but not from himself. And that was the tragedy that was already unfolding, even before the final act came. June 25th, 2009. A date carved into my heart like a knife that will never be removed. I was at home when the news broke. Michael Jackson had died. At first, I refused to believe it. How could someone who seemed larger than life simply vanish in a heartbeat? How could the boy I once held, the man who whispered to me in the dark, be gone forever? The television repeated the words over and over. Cardiac arrest, overdose, hospital, death. I collapsed to the floor, screaming, tears blinding me. No matter how many headlines I had read about his struggles, no matter how many late-night phone calls I had taken where he confessed his fears, I still thought I would have more time. I still thought I would hear his voice again. But the truth was merciless. Michael Jackson was dead at 50, his body finally giving out after years of pain, insomnia, and the poisons that had been prescribed to silence him. The Los Angeles County coroner called it acute propofol intoxication, worsened by benzodiazepines. His death wasn't peaceful. It was classified as a homicide. The doctor entrusted with his care was later convicted of manslaughter. And as the world cried, as candlelight vigils filled the streets, as millions sang his songs in mourning, I cried not just for the legend lost, but for the man I had loved in shadows. A part of my soul died with him that day, but the world wasn't finished with me yet. Days later, Michael's will was read. The details stunned even me. He had written clearly that if his mother, Catherine, could no longer care for his children, custody would go to me, Diana Ross. In that moment, my hands trembled so violently I nearly dropped the paper. Tears blurred the words, but I forced myself to read them again. It wasn't just a legal instruction, it was a love letter. A silent confession written in black ink on white paper. Proof that in Michael's heart, I wasn't just Sister Diana. I was home. I was trust. I was the one he believed could protect the most precious part of his life, his children. Prince, Paris, and Blanket. The world was stunned, but I wasn't. Because, for years, behind the cameras, Michael had whispered his fears to me. Diana, if something happens to me, who will protect them? Who will love them the way I do? And every time, I told him the same thing. You'll never have to worry, Michael. They'll always be safe. His will was his final answer to those fears. His children were his legacy, and in his last written words, he placed that legacy into my hands. After his death, I did not run to cameras. I did not sit for interviews or make public declarations. I chose silence, because I knew Michael would have wanted dignity for his children above all else. But silence didn't mean absence. I called Catherine. I wrote letters. I stood in the background, always watching, always ready to step forward when needed. When the family faced chaos in 2012 and custody briefly shifted to T.J. Jackson, the courts notified me as Michael's will required. I considered it carefully, and I told the press one thing only. Privacy for the children is what matters most. But privately, I did more. I called Paris when her grief pushed her into despair. I reached out to Prince as he found his footing in adulthood. I checked on Blanket when he was still too young to understand the storm around him. Sometimes it was advice. Sometimes it was comfort. Sometimes it was just quiet support that no one outside the family ever saw. Because Michael didn't leave me fame, he left me trust. And I promised him, silently, that I would never break it. Years passed, but his ghost never left me. There are nights even now when I wake up hearing his voice calling my name, when I see his eyes in my dreams, and every time I whisper into the silence, I still believe in you, Michael. I always will. At 81, I am too old to keep secrets. I have learned that silence can protect, but it can also erase. I cannot allow what we shared to be forgotten, twisted, or denied. Michael Jackson was not just my little brother in the industry. He was not just a boy I guided into stardom. He was a man I loved, in ways too complicated for the world to understand, in ways too dangerous to ever confess while he lived. It was a love carried in stolen glances, in midnight phone calls, in hotel rooms hidden behind curtains, in every whispered, "I love you," that never reached the public ear. The world saw him as a legend, but I saw the fragile human being behind the mask. I saw the illnesses that drained him, the insomnia that tortured him, the fear that haunted him, and the strength he borrowed from me when the weight of fame became too heavy. And in return, he gave me the greatest proof of love anyone could ever leave, the trust of his children. So let the world say what it wants. Let them speculate. Let them twist. Let them pretend they know the truth. I know the truth. He knows the truth. And now, so do you. Michael Jackson was my shadow, my love, my wound, and my secret. And until the day I draw my last breath, I will protect his children, his memory, and his place in my heart. Because when he wrote my name into his will, he wasn't just asking me to raise his children. He was telling the world that I was, and always had been, his home.